Ah, hello, dear friends. Today we will be going on a journey through the 70 great mysteries of the ancient world, unlocking the secrets of past civilizations. Sounds very exciting, huh? I discovered this book in my local charity shop. I have an absolutely fantastic charity shop local to me that stores lovely books like this. And I assume, like many of you, I love a list. So 70, a lot to sink our teeth into. I love mysteries. Who doesn't? And of course the ancient world. Love my history. So it screamed to me from the bookshelf to pick it up. Of course, with such a large book, as you can see, we'll have to take our time through it, and this will likely be split up into multiple parts, but let's begin at the start with the hidden truths of myths and legends. So, let's just jump straight into the list, I think, with number 1. The Garden of Eden. Mythical. Could have been possibly somewhere in southern Iraq. I didn't know that it actually had a potential geographic location. And here is a rabbinic parable. Eden is a unique place on earth, but no creature is permitted to know its exact location. In the time to come, God will reveal the path to Eden. So nobody knows where the biblical Garden of Eden lies. God planted an eastward in Eden, Genesis 2:8, which is taken to indicate an area of southern Iraq anciently called the land of Sumer and Akkad. So over the centuries many people have looked for it, but it's never been found. There are similar legends from Sumer, although they lack the sense of sin and punishment present in the Hebrew account. And St. Paul thought of the Garden of Eden as a place of heavenly reward rather than an earthly paradise. Here we have a biblical image of the Garden of Eden as an earthly paradise or a garden of delight. So Adam and Eve here, of course, receiving a blessing from the heavens. We've got, a bountiful garden. I suppose there could be many different places on earth that you could just think are naturally beautiful. We've got some images here of what could have been the Garden of Eden here, I guess. So we've got a picnic in a garden here from a Persian manuscript of the early 16th century. And actually the Persians gave the world the idea of paradise from a word meaning park. Again, every day's a school day. I've learned a couple of things straight away, so I'm very glad I picked this book up. We have here a pool in the Garden of Nebamum from the 18th dynasty Egyptian tomb. The pool is surrounded by trees, providing a welcome shade. So the idea of a garden is deeply rooted in the Semitic psyche, probably as an antithesis to the parched landscapes that lie all around those cultivated areas where people lived in quite arid areas. So I suppose a bountiful garden is almost like a paradise in itself, just the idea of it. And this idea of the garden has been precious in the Near East for millennia. The very name Eden is linked either to an Akkadian word, Edinu, meaning a plain, or more probably to a Hebrew root meaning delight or pleasure. From the earliest times it was linked to the idea of paradise. Our word paradise originates in the old Persian apirites, a park, which became pardes in Hebrew, and then paradisius in Greek. I love the etymology of all of these different words and how they would have originally meant one thing. We got above here the king of Assyria, Assurbanipal, feasting in the palace gardens. This is a relief from the palace of Nineveh in the 7th century. And here we have a reconstructed facade of Nebuchadnezzar, I never say that properly, Nebuchadnezzar's throne room in Babylon with palm trees and shrubs in the 6th century. course, the most famous gardens of all were even renowned in ancient times. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So I suppose that could tie into the concept of Eden as well. The wife of the Babylonian king pined for the wooded mountains of their native land. And in the 20th century, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey thought that he might have identified the foundations of the structure. But more recent archaeological investigation identified an area north of the royal palace where massive irrigated terraces may have been planted with trees and flowers for the use of the king and his family and followers. Here we have a Mesopotamian cylinder seal with 2 figures seated on either side of a sacred tree. And here we have Adam and Eve by Masolino and Masaccio in the 15th century. And here is the snake is in the shape of a female's head, interestingly. So the royal gardens of the ancient Near East are practical evocations of a mythical dream. The image of the biblical Garden of Eden itself is of an earthly or a heavenly paradise to which human beings aspire as a place of rest. In Western civilization, it relates to notions of a golden age or the Happy Isles, the islands of the blessed, and the Elysian fields, and others like them. In the Bible, it's a place of innocence, belonging in an age of innocence, where people could speak with God as a friend, and then we grew up. The tree of knowledge opened our eyes to the reality of our condition, and we became fully human. We knew that we must work to live, that disease, evil, poverty, and death stalk the world. The truth of a parable is very profound and works on the level of the human heart, and today we are more ready to recognize that the Garden of Eden has its place only in our souls, where the meaning of a symbolic myth is more powerful than any concrete fact. It's a good point. How certain fictions and myths are important for the soul and to provide a guiding light or principle as opposed to necessarily having to be a physical place. Here we have number 2, the biblical flood and Noah's Ark, which would have occurred sometime either between the mid-6th millennium BC or just be mythical. Could have happened in the southwestern Turkey area or the Black Sea. Excerpt from Genesis here. So God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. And now I am going to destroy them and the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. I am now going to bring about the flood, water to cover the earth, destroying all living things on it." Just reading that passage now makes me think a little bit of the potential climate change message there, I suppose. It could be a cyclical thing. The violence of mankind eventually harms the world to the point that floods happen and reset, perhaps. I don't know, that's what it just made me think of. Of course, the biblical story of the great flood that drowned the whole world is recounted in the book of Genesis, when God decided to destroy his creation due to the sins of humankind. And Noah was saved because he was a righteous man. So a lot of us, of course, are quite familiar with the story of Noah's Ark. But we have here that the rains continued until the entire surface of the land was submerged, but they ceased eventually and they began to recede. The Ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and Noah sent out birds to see if it was safe to leave. So, the quest for Noah's Ark. People have obviously looked to one mountain peak or another as the place where Noah's Ark came to rest, and in recent times many expeditions have set out to find its remains. There are numerous mountains to choose from in the Near East, and one is Pir Omar Gudrun, called Mount Nisir in the past. It lies near Kirkuk in Iraq, which was ancient Mesopotamia, east of the old Assyrian homeland in the Zagros Mountains. It could also be in the Taurus Mountains, east of Lake Van in Armenia. At the time of the Assyrian Empire, roughly the 9th to 7th centuries BC, this was the kingdom of Urartu. Here we have a image of Noah's Ark resting on Mount Ararat. So the similarity of the name Ararat there with the name we just heard, Urartu, and occasionally Mount Massis, which is the highest peak of this range, has been the object of expeditions expeditions to locate the Ark, so too the Kurdish mountains southeast of Lake Van. But, of course, the Ark has never come to light. It's not really couched in historical terms at all. Not surprisingly, it's mythological in form. It's an early and unsophisticated image of a god who still speaks directly with worshippers, and is depicted as old and all-powerful, but somehow also human in character, which isn't really all that different from the gods of other Near Eastern peoples at the time. But it's often been pointed out that the legend of a great flood, of which the hero survives to bring new life to the world, is actually paralleled in many ancient mythologies from South America to Australasia. Here we've got a tablet of the famous Epic of Gilgamesh from the ancient Babylonia. It recounts the flood story of Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian equivalent of Noah. And here we have a relief, a mosaic in San Marco in Venice, showing Noah and his family in the Ark, releasing all the animals and bears from the Ark as well. Where have all these people come from? Oh, his family, yes, of course. So, the Mesopotamian legend closely resembles the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible, and in 1873 George Smith of the British Museum published the Epic of Gilgamesh. The mythical king of Uruk, with his close companion Enkidu, had many adventures. And when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh, distraught, sets out to find the secret of eternal life from his ancestor Utnapishtim, who had survived the flood, and to whom, together with his wife, the gods had granted immortality. The story is told in some detail, and it's very like the biblical tale of Noah and the Ark, except for its multitude of gods. In the 1920s, the English archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated at the city in southern Mesopotamia. That was the birthplace of the biblical patriarch Abraham. Woolley caused an enormous stir by telegraphing to London that he'd found evidence for the flood at but he hadn't, and neither had later archaeologists excavating at other sites on the southern Mesopotamian plain. What they actually found were deep layers of water-laid silt, interrupting evidence of habitation in the form of pottery, graves, and buildings that were present both below and above the flood levels. And it's just localized silt settles that may not have been a flood, but there's certainly obviously evidence for localized floodings by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers of the land of Sumer and Akkad. And these rivers perforate all of Mesopotamia, and they of course often brought dangers of flooding. If there was an unusually heavy deluge, or perhaps the winter snows melted too fast in the mountains, then these great rivers quickly became torrential. So you have little localized floods anyway, so it must be incredibly difficult for archaeologists to distinguish a flood that may have happened thousands of years ago. So much potential for misinterpretation. This is the flood pit that Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered in the 1920s. And over here we have on board a research vessel that's exploring a submerged ancient shoreline of the Black Sea. So a lot of technology, a lot of serious searching for the Ark. So a lot of people, historians and archaeologists, have assumed that the Noah's flood is basically a folk memory of a flooding event, a very catastrophic one. I suppose if you before travel, like early civilizations, when you wouldn't have even perhaps appreciated that the world was a big place with many, many people in it. A devastating flood, as far as you're concerned, that is your world. That's the universe. It has been flooded. So the memory may have been carried with Abraham's clan on the long journey from Ur to Canaan, and give fresh and monotheistic flavour in their homeland. You can see how it could become embellished over time with spoken stories. But there is a new and fascinating theory proposed by two American scholars, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, who are both geophysicists, particularly interested in the Black Sea. They see the Great Flood as a truly cataclysmic event that occurred in the Black Sea around the middle of the 6th millennium BC. It was then a freshwater lake called the New Eugene Lake by modern geologists. At the time, its surface was some 500 foot below sea level, and the melting of the glaciers at the end of the Ice Age caused a rise in worldwide sea levels. The Mediterranean Sea itself fed from the Atlantic via the Straits of Gibraltar and poured its salt water through the Dardanelles into the Sea of Marmara. At the eastern end, a neck of land blocked the way to New Eugene, but gradually as the sea level rose, the water flowed across that area slowly and then with more rapidity. Then perhaps there was an earthquake that are quite common in Turkey. The neck of the land split apart, so all of this salt water roared into today's Bosphorus and crashed eastward through it, cascading down with immense violence into the lake below. So they estimated around 10 cubic miles of water would have poured west to east through the narrow channel each day for about 2 years. Just going from here to here. Down cutting its bed and carrying all before it, and even so it would have raised the level of the whole of the Black Sea by only about 15 centimetres each day, and the flat land around the lakeshore would have disappeared at the rate of probably a mile a day. So there would have been sadly people living in villages around the lake at that time, as there would have been anywhere, and they would have been able to escape the rising waters with their animals by boat, on donkey, or even on foot if it was necessary. And they would have all taken horrific memories of that flood with them, and then put into folklore and myth as they're recounted, and song and month story across the generations of bards and ordinary people. So they're actually trying that theory out with submarines, taking pictures of the shoreline. So this could very well be the origin of the flood legend, and the opinion of the two American scholars. Noah's story could be a memory of how somebody escaped. That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that it would necessarily have been actually steeped in any form of reality. And here we have Moses and the Exodus as this myth or reality. In the 13th century BC, perhaps in Egypt or the Sinai Peninsula. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go. So the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible opens with an account of the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt and their liberation by Moses from slavery. Which again is a story that I'm sure we are all very common or familiar with, and well, many of us are, but not all scholars believe that either Moses existed or that the Exodus from Egypt ever took place as it is recorded, but many consider that while the biblical account of the miracles of the 10 plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea is mythical as it is presented, it is nevertheless a core of historical information contained in the narratives as found mainly in the books of Exodus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. The two schools of thought are often called minimalist and maximalist, and that controversy over the Exodus story is a part of a much larger debate about the use of the Hebrew Bible as a source for the history of Israel. So the minimalists point to a lack of evidence in Egypt, Sinai or anywhere else. The miraculous nature of the 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, they believe that the biblical narratives were composed much later than the events they purported to describe, between the late 6th and 2nd centuries BC, and were designed for didactic, theological purposes. And there was no such thing as the writing of history at that time, so the stories in the Hebrew Bible are merely myth and folklore, and unreliable and inaccurate. And archaeological and historical research cannot throw light on the Bible. But the maximalists, on the other hand, comprise the majority view, which holds rather different opinions about the nature of the biblical text. They do recognise that the Hebrew Bible was finalised long after the events it reports. And when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple in 587 to 6 BC, they took the leaders of the people from Jerusalem and Judah into exile in Babylon, and it was there, between 586 and 538 BC, that the final versions of many of the books of the Bible were collated from the various oral and written sources that exiles had to hand. So the biblical narrative thus still retains a considerable amount of accurate historical information. And here we have an area. This is Mount Sinai and the surrounding peaks here. And here we have Moses holding the tablets of the 10 Commandments, where the Israelites are huddled below. And here we have the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, while the pursuing Egyptians drown in the waters. The scholars point out that there is a primary narrative concerning the group led by Moses who received the law, the Torah, at Mount Sinai. In addition to the Exodus under Moses, the biblical account also preserves traces of several journeys in Sinai, so it's at least possible that the ancestral Israelites were coming and going over a long period. So, were there Israelites in Egypt to begin with? The route of the Exodus here, which is currently a mystery. It's not even known why the Hebrew Yam Suf was translated into English as the red rather than the reed sea, and it's not known where it was. So there's no consensus about the identification of the Israelite camps, but perhaps this isn't surprising because the Bedouin tribes of Sinai would hardly have perpetuated Hebrew place names. So the route through the mountains are untraceable. Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites encamped for nearly 40 years before continuing their journey to Canaan, might be identified with the oasis of Ain Qudrat in northeastern Sinai, but there are no remains there dating from the appropriate period. Moses died and was buried on Mount Nebo in Moab. It was Joshua who led the people across the Jordan and into the hill country of Canaan. So there's little proof of the conquest of the land. But there is evidence of the establishment of small farming villages in these hills for the first time, dating between the 13th and 11th centuries BC. And at the same time, the lands bordering the East Mediterranean were under attack by migrants from the Aegean world. So in Egyptian texts, these groups are referring to the sea peoples, and among them were the Philistines, who were settled in the area now known as the Gaza Strip. And refugees from the disruption on the coastal plain made new lives for themselves in villages in the hill country inland, where they met with Israelites coming from the east. There are many signs of technological innovations in the agricultural communities that were that they established together. And an interesting fact is that in contrast to the contemporaneous coastal settlements, there is no evidence of pig bones among the animal remains. So from the majority of these villages. So it may well indicate that not only the presence of Israelites in the hill villages, but also the fact that it was their religious beliefs that governed these communities. And there is one more piece of evidence for conclusive proof of the presence of Israelites in Canaan in the late 12th and 11th century. So in the 5th year of his reign, the Egyptian pharaoh Meneptah campaigned through the area in the hope of re-establishing Egyptian control. In the commemorative monument he later set up at Karnak, listing his conquests, he noted that amongst others, Canaan he had utterly destroyed the people of Israel. So it's ironic that the first extra-biblical note of the existence of Israel also lays claim to its total destruction. So although there is direct proof for Moses and the Exodus lacking, there is considerable body of circumstantial evidence that's hard to ignore about the settlement and the location. So it ultimately comes down to individual conviction, but for those who believe in the essential truth of the events recounted in the Bible, there's a mystery that will always surround these narratives. Here we have the sea peoples depicted on the walls of Medinet Habu in Luxor in Egypt, and the Israel Stela of Meneptah recording his victories in Canaan. The lost cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, potentially between 3150 to 1550 BC, that's a big old time frame, in Jordan. So then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. From Genesis. So the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most intriguing stories told in the Old Testament of the Bible and repeated in the Quran. The main characters are the greatest patriarch Abraham and his nephew Lot, and they were burdened with the serious moral dilemmas of land rights, homosexuality, succession, incest, all still relevant today, and the episode has been regarded simply as an analogy for the study of biblical ethics. So in the story, they travelled through the land of Canaan as shepherds, grazing their flocks, until the animals grew so numerous that the land couldn't longer support them. So they separated and went to Lot chose the well-watered plain of the Jordan Valley and went to live near Sodom, one of the 5 prosperous cities of the plain, and others being Adam, Zeboim and swore, but the men of Sodom were homosexual sinners apparently, and God warned them that if they did not repent, he would destroy them. And Abraham debated with God regarding the ethics of destroying righteous people along with the guilty until it was realized that Lot was the only righteous person in Sodom. Right, okay. So 2 angels were sent to warn Lot of the impending destruction of Sodom, and when the Sodomites heard of Lot's heavenly visitors, they went to his house and demanded to see them. Fearing that the wicked Sodomites would molest the angels, Lot offered the crowd his 2 virgin daughters instead. Finally, the angels blinded the Sodomites at the door and told Lot to flee immediately with his family. God rained down fire and brimstone on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot escaped towards the cities of Zoar with his wife and 2 daughters, but on the way, Lot's wife disobeyed God's instruction not to look back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Lot was afraid to stay in Zoar and instead sought refuge in a cave along with his daughters. After a long period of isolation, the daughters feared they'd never meet a man who could father their children and continue their lineage, so together they agreed to get their father drunk and seduce him when he was unaware of what he was doing. And 2 sons resulted from these incestuous unions, Moab and Ben-Ami, the forefathers of the Moabite and Ammonite tribes. So what evidence do we have of any of that is true? There is, of course, certain natural and geological phenomena in the Dead Sea area which seem to corroborate the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and recent archaeological discoveries that lend credibility to the biblical account. I mean, I'm reticent to insert my own opinion here, as I'm just simply flicking through the information presented, but I feel quite uncomfortable reading out the account of Sodom there. To me, it just feels like the raving fanfic of a bigot, basically. It's just, yes, just looking for the most extreme, violent version of subjugating homosexuality because it's diverse from your own way of thinking or being in a kind of rather dramatic and campy account itself, really. It's not a big fan. I'm sorry if you disagree with me, but that's just how I feel. I'm not a big fan of that. I'm a humanist in nature. Every single living soul on this planet deserves a right to an existence that is comfortable and pleasurable, ideally. So, biblical phenomena occurring naturally. So, of course, earthquakes occur quite regularly in the Dead Sea as a result of huge land masses sliding apart and subsiding. And we know that from historical records, the whole cities elsewhere have been devastated in the past by earthquakes, and they would be particularly severe when located on a geographical fault or geological fault. So the Dead Sea, lying below sea level in this deep rift valley, is a high saline body of water, and salt formations are common features around its shores. So salt pillars are created, which sometimes by chance resemble human forms. And if anything falls into the Dead Sea, it's rapidly encrusted by salt. So it's not really hard to imagine how the story of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt could have actually stemmed from some natural process like this. And we've got some soft marks around the Dead Sea producing pillars. So there we go, that's a pillar of salt. And another weird characteristic of the Dead Sea is that it's rich in bitumen, which periodically surfaces as large lumps of oil slicks. So it's reminiscent of an episode where the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah got stuck in slime pits as they fled during a battle with the kings of Syria. Fist-sized sulfur nodules are commonly found embedded in the soft, marly soils around the Dead Sea shores, and the ancient writers of the Old Testament story of Sodom and Gomorrah certainly must have been aware of these flammable balls, which they called brimstone. And their description of a burning deluge raining down from heaven and destroying cities may have well been inspired by these strange objects. So actually looking for Sodom and Gomorrah, over a century biblical scholars and archaeologists have attempted to locate the sites, but initially debated around whether or not they were located in the northern or southern part of the Dead Sea. In 1851, de Saulcy conducted a survey northwest of the Dead Sea, suggesting that Jericho and Qumran were the lost biblical cities. In the 1920s, which seemed like a bit of a golden age for exploration now, doesn't it? Father Alexis Pallon's excavations at Taylor Castle on the northeastern shore revealed a large Chalcolithic period settlement, which seemed to be a more plausible alternative. In 1896, a unique mosaic floor map dating to the 6th to 7th centuries AD was discovered in Madaba in modern Jordan, and on this map, Zor, the city that Lot had initially escaped to, was located at the southeast end of the Dead Sea. The area had been described by the classical historians Diodorus, Strabo, Josephus and Tacitus, and later by the medieval Arab geographers Yaqut Masudi, Muqaddasi and Ibn Abbas. In 1924, William F. Albright, the Reverend Melvin G. Kyle and Father Alexis Mallon and others surveyed the region hoping to verify the location of Zor. Its identification with the land of Moab led them to the search of the south of the Mujib River, identified as the biblical Arnon. They investigated the Lisan Peninsula and the nearby valleys and concluded that the modern town of Safi was ancient Zor, a theory that had first been put forward much earlier by Sir John Mondeville during his visit between 1322 and 1356. Another proposition is that the cities of the plain had disappeared below the waters of the Dead Sea, and then in the late 19th century several small islands were recorded in the north end of the sea by William Lynch, which had now become submerged. It's also being studied from the NASA satellite photographs and by submarine investigation of its seafloor, looking for any sign of lost cities. But it does seem plausible that they could be under there. So that's that map showing the cities of the city of Zor, and an excavation trench at Bab Edra showing a burnt destruction phase dating to the early Bronze Age. And we've got inside Mount Sodom, which is made of salt here, creating these soaring caves. Quite a dramatic, geographic image there. Recent excavations have been made along the geological fault lines of the southern Dead Sea Basin in the 70s and 80s, discovering large once thriving settlements there. Some ended with fiery destruction during the early Bronze Age, which could correspond to the legendary cities of the plain. And during the 1990s, Constantinos Politis excavated Dir Ein Abad Nisafi, uncovering a church built over a cave in which early Byzantine Christians believed Lot took refuge after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So while the Old Testament is primarily considered a book of moral guidelines, it's intriguing that modern archaeological and geographical discoveries are confirming the physical and historical landscape in which the improbable story of Sodom and Gomorrah really could have taken place. It's really interesting reading through these, how, yes, it looks like a lot of these mythical stories have been used to provide guidance or policy, societal policy and cultural policy, but they have been steeped in actual events that happened. I mean, a theory that I've always thought is, what would religion look like and what would faith look like today if social media were around during these times? Because everybody can have their own perception of an event now and share it across the world and just get subscribers and followers to that idea. Whereas, of course, at this time you only had certain individuals who could write and disseminate that information out. And those hierarchies that are established are obviously so deeply entrenched into the grain of our fabric from that point as a foundational pillar that, of course, people subscribe to them to this very day. But it's just so interesting that, you can find archaeological or geographical evidence of biblical stories actually having taken place, and then determine whether or not it's likely that it's hearsay or folk stories that led to their creation. We have here Atlantis, fact or fiction. So unknown could be 9600 BC or 1520 BC, which again is a massive time scale, basically mythical. Could be in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. Here's a quote from Plato in the 4th century BC. When you were speaking yesterday about your city and citizens, the tale which I have just been repeating to you came into my mind. some mysterious coincidence you agreed in almost every particular with the narrative of Solon. So imagine a great and powerful nation rooted in the deepest strata of human antiquity, whose dominance over the ancient world virtually overnight as a result of unimaginable cataclysm is one that has intrigued people for more than 2 millennia. We're of course referring to Atlantis. So it's said to have reached its peak more than 11,000 years ago, but it's not until a little more than 2,350 years ago, sometime between 359 and 347 BC, that it surfaces in literature. Its name appears in 2 dialogues by the Greek philosopher Plato, Timaeus and Critias, named for the main correspondence in 2 of Plato's imaginary conversations between Socrates and his students. Here we have the marble sculpture of Plato. At the outset of the Timaeus dialogue, Socrates mentions the previous day's discussion of the perfect society, and Plato is referring to his most famous dialogue, the Republic, written several years earlier. Plato then has Socrates enumerate the features of the perfect government represented in the Republic. Artisans and farmers would be separated from the military, soldiers would be merciful, trained in athletics and music, would live communally, and would own no gold, silver, or private property. Socrates despairs of hypothetical discussions and gives his students an assignment in what amounts to applied philosophy. He suggests that they should exemplify the perfection of a society that lives according to the precepts laid out in the Republic by engaging them in a just war. Critias, dutifully carrying out the suggestions of his teacher, volunteers. Then listen, Socrates, to a tale which, though strange, is certainly true. Critias says that he also heard this story from his grandfather, who in turn maintained that he heard it from his own father, Tropides, who heard it from the Greek sage Solon, who heard it originally from the Egyptian priests when he was in Egypt shortly after 600 BC. So a lot of passing down there. By Plato's own account in Critias, we are reading an indirect version of a story that had originated more than 200 years previously. So the Egyptian priests told Solon a tale about an ancient Athens, which was the best governed of all cities. And it is this ancient Athens of 9,300 years before Plato's time that serves as a model for the perfect state. The priests tell Solon of the most heroic deed of the ancient Athenians, where that they defeated in battle a mighty power, which unprovoked made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and describe the expansionist nation as originating beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. And the name of this great power was Atlantis. It held sway across northern Africa and all the way to Egypt. But after the defeat in battle by the Athenians, Critias tells us that Atlantis was totally destroyed by the gods and in a tremendous cataclysm of earthquakes and floods. After outlining the Atlantis story, Critias remarks to Socrates, "When you were speaking yesterday about your city and citizens, the tale which I have just been repeating to you came into my mind, and I remarked with astonishment how, by some mysterious coincidence, you agreed in almost every particular with the narrative of Solon." In fact, Critias' description of the society of ancient Athens makes it a perfect, detailed, and not coincidental match for Plato's hypothetical perfect nation described in his Republic. So did Plato base this description of Atlantis or ancient Athens on actual history, or did he fabricate the entire episode? So there was a significant Mediterranean civilization, Minoan Crete, ancient even from the perspective of the Greeks of Plato's time, that was at least partially destroyed by a major cataclysm. Here we have the memorial of Taladimos and Lycaeus, warriors killed in the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which could have used a bit of inspiration between the Athens and Atlantis War. And a map of Atlantis by Arthenius shown 1678, situating it as Plato indicated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. The north is at the bottom here. Some scholars have suggested that the size and location of Atlantis were greatly exaggerated or mistaken in Critias, and Plato's tale is based ultimately on the cataclysmic eruption of the volcano on Thera, which is an island located to the east of Greece and north of Crete in the Aegean Sea, which I have been to. Thera is actually Santorini, where I had my honeymoon. Very nice. Beautiful, actually. Best Krakatoa, which when it erupted in AD 1883 killed tens of thousands of people. So the larger eruption on Thera must have had an even more devastating impact and would have likely warranted mention in the historical records of places like Egypt where the impact was indirect. If you've ever been to Santorini or know it, the caldera, it's like almost like a moon. It's like a moon-shaped island now because there's like the volcano in the middle and then there's the sea around it, and the rest of Santorini that exists above the water is like a moon shape around it. And it's like a high cliff face here, so the settlements and the places you can stay on this side of the island are all right at the top of it, at the top of this cliff. So it just means you get the most beautiful, unobstructed views of sunsets over the ocean. It's so beautiful. For some, Minoan Crete is Atlantis, and in Critias, Plato presents a somewhat distorted picture of its destruction, and as a result, the eruption of Thera. To maintain it, however, one has to ignore the fact, or at least explain why, Crete is in the wrong location, or is the wrong size, flourished at the wrong time, never fought a war with Athens, and was not destroyed cataclysmically. So a lot going against it. So archaeology shows that Minoan coastal communities were badly damaged by the tsunamis generated by the Theran eruption. But the civilization not only survived, but flourished for perhaps 2 centuries afterwards. Other authors have asserted that the fabulous Minoan colony on Thera was the model for Atlantis, and the Minoan settlement there was obliterated by the eruption of the volcano, but equally certainly, Plato was not speaking about the destruction of merely an outpost, impressive though it was, of an ancient civilization. At the same time, Thera is still in the wrong place, clearly the wrong size and the wrong age to be a direct model for Plato's Atlantis. Here we have the Minoan Palace, or the Temple of Knossos, dating to the mid-2nd millennium BC, a complex building with numerous rooms, many fine wall paintings. Here's the throne room in Knossos, Crete, painted griffins and plants. Here we have the rock crystal vase in the Minoan Palace at Zakros in eastern Crete. The obvious technical sophistication of the Minoans reflected in their art and architecture has led some to search for commonalities between this civilization and the extremely advanced Atlantean society described in Plato's dialogues. So of course no discussion about Atlantis would be complete without the mention of the truly fantastic claims made about the lost continent in the 19th and 20th centuries. More than anyone else, Minnesota Congressman, twice-veiled vice-presidential aspirant and amateur historian Ignatius Donnelly revived the myth with the 1881 publication of his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. For Donnelly, Plato's Atlantis is the root of all cultural achievement and the source for civilization in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley and Europe, as well as South and North America. His thesis does not bear up well under the scrutiny of modern archaeology or geology because there's no evidence that these cultures all owe their evolution to another primary source, let alone Atlantis. But compared to some other late 19th and 20th century thinkers, however, Donnelly is a model of intellectual restraint. That's very democratically said. The Theosophists, led by Helena Blavatsky, suggested that Atlanteans flew in aeroplanes and grew crops obtained from extraterrestrial aliens. And late 20th century psychics have claimed to be in touch with spirits in the lost continent, providing all manner of Atlantean advice for denizens in the modern world. Of course, no evidence has been forthcoming to support the validity of these claims. So it is doubtless that the case that Plato used the record with which he was familiar to graph his Atlantean means he was familiar with craft to his Atlantean dialogues. Perhaps there was traditions of an ancient natural catastrophe that destroyed a powerful nation more than 1,000 years before Plato's time, and he exploited those stories to convey the message. Maybe he was concocting these stories to imply metaphors for the moral he was attempting to impart. So, for example, Rodney Castleton, in his book Atlantis Destroyed, argues that Plato's Atlantis is a good match of a combination of Minoan Crete and Thera, while at the same time recognizing that part of the story is a retelling of more recent history, including the Peloponnesian War, which pitted Athens against Sparta. Sparta was victorious, and its political structure appears to have made its way into Plato's description of ancient Athens. For Plato, Atlantis is not so much a civilization as a plot device. The detailed details he puts into the mouth of Critias are not intended as history, but instead serve a more important function to a writer who is after all not a historian but a philosopher. And to make his point, Plato must make Atlantis a nearly insurmountable adversary. The detailed description of Atlantis is was intended necessarily to impress the reader with material wealth, technological sophistication and military power, so that the smaller, materially poorer, technologically less well endowed and militarily weak Athenians could defeat them, conveying an essential message that what matters in history is not just the wealth or power. What's important is the way a people govern themselves. So for Plato, the intellectual achievement of a perfect government and society is far more important and is victorious over material wealth or power. And it is to Plato's credit as a teacher that he tells a ripping good tale in making that point. Oh yes, absolutely, I love that, a philosopher telling a story so well that for thousands of years afterwards people dedicate their entire lives to exploring the fact behind your fiction. It's incredible, really, isn't it? So I think we can put a pin in our journey and start the next part with our Trojan War. This is a juicy book. I'm going through it for the first time with you, of course, like I always do, but I'm learning so much already, so I'm very excited to crack on and explore more of these mysteries.